The thing about grief, it doesn't always howl.
Sometimes it lingers, soft, measured, like silk draped over cold bones, perfumed, poised, sipping from a golden cup, while somewhere deep beneath polished marble, a storm quietly claws at the skin. You know, like that one guest at the funeral who's already planning the next wedding. And in ancient Rome, where the marble gleamed smoother than a senator's conscience, grief often wore the face of obsession. Picture this. An emperor stands alone on the balcony of his golden palace, not weeping, not praying, just watching stars flicker in the heavy Roman sky. His wife, Poppaea Sabina, ambitious, beautiful, and sharp as a dagger in the dark, is gone, dead, and you'd think that would be the end of the love story. But Nero wasn't exactly the move-on in journal type. And somewhere in the belly of that same palace, a tailor is stitching silk to a body that looks nothing like her, but is being remade by an emperor who cannot let go. Because when grief hits rich, unstable men, sometimes they buy fast horses, sometimes they rebuild their wives. You are not dreaming. You are in Nero's Rome. It is the year 66 AD, and the emperor, just 29 years old, is about to marry a boy named Sporus, cruelly transformed, draped in the robes of a ghost, and called his wife. Long before people argued about pronouns, Rome had emperors assigning them, with a knife. Welcome, sleeper. Wherever you're listening, Cape Town, Cairo, Kampala, or maybe even the shadowed corners of Rome herself, whisper to us softly in the comments, like a secret carried on the wind through the forum stones. Because tonight's story isn't just about an emperor. It's about memory, and how far the powerful will go when letting go is not an option they recognize. Tonight's story is about how a boy, barely grown, was shaped into the ghost of a woman too perfect to stay dead by a man too powerful to be denied. This is no myth, no Shakespearean tale. This happened, and history, for all its dust and glory, has never quite dared to look it in the eye. Close your windows, dim the firelight, listen carefully as we drift back to the final gilded years of an empire woven with madness. Picture this. You're standing in the golden halls of the Roman imperial palace, marble floors gleaming like mirrors, the scent of foreign incense clinging to the air like gossip. Guards line the corridors, not out of pride, but fear, because this isn't just a palace. It's a stage, and the man in charge? He thinks he's the lead actor, director, and god. That man is Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudians, a boy emperor turned performer, tyrant, and monster. Nero wasn't born evil, not exactly. He was born into ambition. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had married her way back into power after being exiled by a previous emperor. Then, with the precision of a palace spider, she maneuvered her son Nero onto the throne at just 16. 16. When most boys are struggling to grow beards, Nero was growing an empire. At first, he played the part of a golden prince. He gave the people games, cut taxes, and even dabbled in poetry. The Senate pretended to like him, and the people genuinely did, for a while. But then something curdled in the wine. Maybe it was the weight of the crown. Maybe it was the freedom absolute power offers to a fragile ego. Or maybe Nero just got bored of pretending. He grew suspicious, paranoid, and worse, theatrical. Now, Nero didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be worshipped. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, a god among men. He forced senators to applaud his terrible singing. He acted in tragedies and insisted everyone cry at the right moments. Those who didn't, well, let's just say the applause was always thunderous. And then came the bodies. First, his stepbrother Britannicus, poisoned during dinner like it was dessert. Then his own mother, Agrippina. She tried to hold the reins too tightly, so he loosened them with a dagger. But of all the twisted chapters in Nero's life, few compare to the death of Poppaea Sabina, his second wife. Poppaea was stunning, ambitious, and calculating, a woman who knew how to stay close to power without getting burned. Until one day, she did. He kicked her to death. Some say it was during a quarrel. Others say she criticized his singing. Either way, she was pregnant. And she died. Here, something strange happened to Nero. He mourned, genuinely. For the first time, the monster flinched. He wept for her, built statues, issued a public mourning. He called her a goddess, but grief twisted into something else, something more grotesque. He didn't want to move on. He wanted her back. And in a place like Nero's Rome, where cruelty and desire held hands, he would find a way. Around the palace, whispers started about how the emperor was searching for someone. Someone young, beautiful, effeminate, with soft features, skin like porcelain, a face that could pass almost perfectly for Poppaea's. And that's when Sporus came into the story. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because before we meet the boy who would become Nero's bride, we need to understand the man who made it possible. A man who ruled the known world like it was a fever dream, who performed tragedies by day and lived them by night, who looked in the mirror and saw not a ruler, but a god in costume. And in the wake of Poppaea's death, he wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a ghost. He wasn't chosen for his wit, or his charm, or even his silence. He was chosen because when Nero looked at him, something in the grief didn't scream quite as loudly. His name was Sporus, at least for a while. 15, maybe 16. A servant, a shadow, the kind of boy who slips through a corridor, unnoticed unless someone wants to notice. And now someone had. Let's be clear, this wasn't about love. This was grief, twisted and lacquered in gold. Because when Poppaea died, whether from illness, childbirth complications, or a temper-fueled imperial kick, depending on which historian you believe, Nero didn't retreat into mourning. He rewrote reality. He didn't want a new wife. He wanted the same one, breathing again, walking again, smiling the way she used to, just for him. So he found someone pliable, and that was Sporus. Sporus wasn't picked for any romantic fantasy. He was picked because he could be made to resemble her. A mirror, not a partner. He was never meant to be seen. That's how boys like Sporus survived in places like Rome, by blending in, moving quietly, bowing low, answering only when spoken to. Palaces were dangerous for the visible, and this one, Nero's, was more stage than state. But now the stage demanded a new actress. The whispers said Sporus was operated on, held down, silenced with coin and cloth, surgically changed to erase the man before he could become one. Rome had no word for this kind of violence, so instead they called it devotion. When Sporus re-emerged, he wore a veil, not one of mourning, one of replacement. And Nero? He smiled, and the transformation began quietly. No announcements, no warnings, just sudden whispers in the palace. Halls about a boy being dressed in silks, usually reserved for the empress. Picture this, a teenage servant who once scrubbed marble floors, now standing still for hours while tailors draped him in violet and gold. They taught him to walk differently, softer, to tilt his chin just so, to answer questions with downcast eyes and a half-smile Poppaea was known for. A name was removed, and in its place, Poppaea's. Nero began to introduce the boy as his wife. At banquets, senators nodded, too afraid to choke on their wine. In the streets, Rome buzzed, confused, amused, aroused, enraged, but mostly silent. Because silence was what Nero demanded. And silence is cheaper than rebellion. They say he wed Sporus in a public ceremony, placed a ring on his finger, laid him in the bed once kept for queens, even had him accompany imperial processions, sitting beside him in golden litters, waving like a memory that refused to fade. It was a play, and Rome played along, because this was an empire that could murder its emperors but still flinch at their madness. Sporus, now Poppaea in skin, was never asked. Not if he agreed, not if he believed, not if he was still inside there, behind the rouge and perfume. Some historians, the braver ones, suggest he played the role with eerie grace, that he performed womanhood so perfectly. Even Nero believed the lie. But others argue he simply vanished. That which stood beside the emperor was no longer a boy. Not a man, not a woman, not even a ghost. Just obedience wrapped in silk. Then came the part no one talked about aloud, not even in gossip. One evening, Sporus was led into a room with a single man. Not a doctor, not a court advisor, a specialist. The kind of man you call when you want something done quickly, quietly, and permanently. There, in silence, Sporus was castrated. The whispers said he had been operated on, that he was held down, silenced with coin and cloth, and surgically changed to erase the man before he could become one. Rumors say he was not in a sterile surgical theater, of course. This was ancient Rome. This was dim torchlight, clenched teeth, and an emperor's shadow stretching across the floor. Rome had no word for this kind of violence. So instead, they called it devotion. We don't know if he screamed, but we do know he survived it. And when he re-emerged, he was no longer Sporus. He was Sabina, Poppaea's name, Poppaea's gowns, Poppaea's perfume. Imagine watching this play out at court, senators lifting their wine cups a little slower, guards blinking twice, servants catching each other's glances, but saying nothing. Because now, Sabina sat at Nero's side, silent, graceful, ringed in gold, wearing the empress's favorite scent, wearing her smile, wearing her place. Most Romans didn't flinch. Why would they? They had already seen Nero kill his mother, his first wife, his advisors, even, according to some, his voice coach. Because yes, Nero fancied himself a performer, and bad reviews were fatal. What was one more absurdity in an empire ruled by theater? And so, Rome did what Rome did best. It nodded. It sipped. It whispered in private, but bowed in public. Sporus, now Sabina, began appearing at banquets and public ceremonies, in veils and jewels. He was no longer introduced as a boy or a companion. He was introduced as Nero's wife. The Senate received it without question. The guards escorted her with military precision. And Nero? He kissed her in public, held her hand, told poets to immortalize his undying love for the reincarnated Poppaea. And through it all, Sporus, the real boy, somewhere deep inside, disappeared a little more with each passing day. Some say he was brilliant in the role, perfect posture, eyes always lowered, a voice so soft it barely rippled the wine. Others claimed the boy had vanished entirely, that beneath the silks and perfumes, there was nothing left but a hollow mimic, a moving statue of grief sculpted by imperial madness. But Nero believed it. And in Rome, when the emperor believes something, it becomes truth. Until, of course, the knives come out. Some historians, the braver ones, suggest he played the role with eerie grace, that he performed womanhood so perfectly, even Nero believed the lie. but others argue he simply vanished. That which stood beside the emperor was no longer a boy, not a man, not a woman, not even a ghost, just obedience wrapped in silk. And as Rome watched, barely breathing, the most powerful man in the empire held hands with a phantom, kissed lips shaped by memory and madness, called a name that no longer belonged to anyone alive. The palace applauded. The poets wrote odes they would later burn. And Sporus endured, because in Nero's Rome, to resist was death, and to disappear was the only way to survive. You'd think Rome would draw the line somewhere. After all, this was the empire of law, of order, of great forms and greater pride. But lines in Rome were drawn in sand, and Nero, he didn't just cross them. He danced over them in golden sandals. So when word began to spread that the emperor would soon marry again, people prepared themselves for scandal. What they got was theater, and at its center, veiled in silk and silence, stood Sporus, no longer a servant, now a bride. They say the ceremony was held at night. Fitting, really. Things like this didn't belong in daylight. Candles lit the arches of a private palace hall. Musicians played softly. And there, before a gathering of Rome's most obedient and most frightened elites, the emperor placed a ring on the finger of a boy he had renamed after his dead wife. Not metaphorically, literally. Sporus had been wiped clean. He wore Poppaea's jewelry, sat in Poppaea's chair, and now took Poppaea's place as wife, as companion, as the public consort of Rome's most dangerous man. The guests didn't clap. They smiled too tightly, drank too quickly. The wine went down hard that night. Because what do you say when the emperor marries a ghost? You don't object. You survive. Some historians say this was the moment. Nero lost even the thin thread of control he'd held. Others say, no, this was the moment Rome lost its right to be shocked. And you, sitting there in the candlelight, a senator maybe, or a cousin of someone important, you knew exactly what not to do. You didn't blink. You didn't ask, isn't that a boy? You just raised your glass and whispered something polite about the emperors. Taste in pearls. But outside those gold walls, the city rumbled. Rome is old, but it remembers. And even the most decadent streets began to whisper. Because this was more than a wedding. It was a performance. And Rome had seen many plays. It just didn't like this ending. Nero took Sporus everywhere. Banquets, games, private performances. He paraded him as empress, praised his beauty, compared him, often aloud, to Poppaea, sometimes forgetting, pretending to forget, that they were not the same. And Sporus? He never corrected him, because statues don't speak. And in Nero's arms, that's all Sporus had become. If this is what Nero did in public, what did he do behind closed doors? Stay with us. Now, there's a kind of madness that shouts. And then there's the kind that sings. Nero preferred the latter. While Rome whispered, while senators exchanged glances in marble halls, Nero tuned his lyre and performed to the gods, to guests, to anyone too afraid to leave. He wasn't just an emperor. He was the headliner of an empire-sized tragedy. And Sporus? He was the silent co-star, still veiled, still smiling, still trying to breathe beneath a dead woman's name. The empire was cracking, but inside Nero's golden palace, the Domus Aurea, his glittering fever dream, everything gleamed. Gold leaf on the ceilings, perfume in the fountains, and a bride who didn't blink. Imagine it, outside. Grain prices soared, rebellions brewed, and the army grew restless. Inside, Nero played dress-up. He'd step on stage in Greek robes, sometimes barefoot, sometimes cloaked in leopard skins, reciting poetry while Sporus watched from a throne too big for a boy. The court would clap. Not too loud, just enough. Because when your emperor thinks he's a god, you don't give him applause. You give him reverence and hope he doesn't ask for your opinion. Still, the empire did what empires do. It waited, it watched, and it whispered. Because even in Rome, performance has a limit. Whispers became petitions. Petitions became plots. And plots, well, Rome had a long tradition of sharp solutions. The Senate, once content to bow, began to mutter. The generals, once loyal, started to calculate. And far from the golden halls, a quiet message passed from hand to hand. It's time. Nero didn't see it. Or maybe he refused to. He still toured with Sporus, still referred to him as Empress, still composed verses comparing his love to the rebirth of Venus. And the empire? It winced, because when a man mourns by marrying a memory, that's personal. But when that man commands armies, names horses as senators, and floods the streets with gold while citizens starve, that's political. They say Sporus never spoke out. Not once. Not even when Nero began to tremble. Because madness doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it's just fear in a purple robe. When the final letters arrived, orders from the Senate declaring him an enemy of the state, Nero fled. No army rose for him. No citizens wept. Just one boy followed. Still veiled. Still silent. Still wearing someone else's crown. And if you're wondering why he stayed, why Sporus didn't run, didn't scream, didn't shatter the illusion, well, you try telling the most dangerous man in the empire that you're not his wife. You try surviving after. Imagine this. A golden palace, once glowing with torchlight, now empty. The lyre strings still. The laughter gone. Rome hasn't exhaled yet, but it's listening. Because Nero, the emperor who once bathed in applause and bathed others in fear, is running. He left in disguise, of course. That's how these things go. Not in glory. In shadows. With a scarf over his face and sandals too dusty for a man who used to demand roses beneath his feet. Sporus was with him, still dressed in the silks of a woman long buried, still pretending this was a marriage, still pretending he had a choice. Rome had turned. The generals? Gone. The Senate? Furious. Even the Praetorian Guard, once his private theater audience, had backed away, palms clean. And so Nero, hunted by the same empire he once serenaded, hid in a villa outside the city. There, surrounded by a few former slaves and fewer friends, he waited. Not for rescue, for the end. They say he paced the floor, muttering lines from Greek tragedies. Picture that. An emperor reciting poetry while death knocks at the door. Still acting, even now. Still Nero. He asked one of the men with him, a freedman, to help him die. When the man hesitated, Nero did it himself. With a dagger. To the throat. But it wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. He flinched. Fumbled. The freedman helped him after all. And so ended the emperor who called himself divine, who renamed a boy after his dead wife, who sang as the city groaned beneath him. Sporus was there. They don't say what he did, but what could he have done? After Nero's death, Rome didn't cheer. It sighed. Picture this, a city waking up from a dream. It didn't remember choosing. Statues of Nero were quietly removed. His name was scratched from marble. The Senate pretended it had never liked his plays. And Sporus? He didn't vanish. Not yet. He was past like property to one of the new emperors, Emphidius Sabinus. A name history barely bothers with, because even tyrants get outshone by spectacle. But Sabinus wanted more than a symbol. He wanted Sporus as a partner, as a wife. He promised to finish what Nero started, another wedding. Imagine this. You've outlived the emperor who forced you into a dress. You've survived being renamed, rewired, reintroduced to the world as someone you never agreed to be. And now, you belong to someone else. That was Sporus. After Nero's death, you'd think Rome might have let the boy disappear. But power has a funny sense of humor, especially when it wears a crown. The next man to claim Sporus Nymphidius Sabinus wasn't an emperor. Not officially. Just a powerful Praetorian Guard commander with more ambition than restraint. And like Nero, he wanted a queen. Not a queen. The queen. Poppaea. He took Sporus into his home, praised his beauty in public, whispered to senators about a wedding that would restore dignity to Rome. Because nothing says political stability like forcing a traumatized teenager into a second royal marriage. Sporus was quiet. Always quiet. But silence doesn't mean agreement. And in a world where men wrote history, it's the silences that scream loudest. So maybe he ran. Maybe he swallowed something. Maybe he just stopped waking up. Either way, there would be no second ceremony. Sporus never made it to the altar. We don't know exactly how. Only that, one day, he died. Some say suicide. Others, silence. All we know is that the boy who was renamed, repackaged, veiled, and paraded was finally gone. Imagine this. A dress was folded neatly on a marble bench, a crown that no longer fits, a boy who wanted to live, but was only ever allowed to perform. Rome forgot him, but not tonight. So let the torches burn just a little longer. There is no veil, no throne, just a name that history refused to hold on to. Today, we don't build statues for Sporus. We don't teach him in schools. He isn't on the coins, or the columns, or the walls. But he was there, in the rooms, in the shadows. You could walk the ruins of Rome and pass the very steps he was dragged across. You could stand beneath a crumbling archway and never know a boy once wept behind it, wearing a crown that wasn't his. Sometimes you'll hear people ask, why didn't he just leave? Ah, yes, the modern luxury of choice. As if walking away was ever an option when your entire existence was curated by emperors with abandonment issues. As if someone could just take off the veil and rejoin the world. Try that in a society where men were gods and boys were stage props. So tonight, as the fire dims low and your eyes get heavy, think of him not as Nero's bride, not as Poppaea reborn, just a boy in a veil. A boy who outlived his emperor. A boy who was never allowed to be a boy simply. Sleep comes slowly to ghosts like him. But at least now, you remember. And now, the last echoes fade. The gold has turned to dust. The veil's folded away. And Rome, at last, is quiet. You've walked through shadowed halls and silken lies. You've watched a boy renamed, reimagined, remembered. And now, in this hush, as the fire softens and your eyes grow heavy, there is nothing more to do, nothing more to carry. Let it go. The noise, the names, the ache of history. You are not in Rome anymore. You are here, where the floor is still, and the light moves like a whisper across your wall. So breathe, long and slow. Let the weight of emperors slip off your shoulders. Let the story stay behind. Because not all memories belong to us. Some just pass through, like soft footsteps on ancient stone. And if a veil lingers at the edge of your dream, or you hear a faint voice say, "I was there," don't be afraid. It's just a story, gently remembering you. Now, close your eyes. You've made it through the silence. You've stayed until the end. And the boy in the veil? He's quiet now, too. Sleep comes softly here. You've been listening to the silent, sleepless historian.